Governments are aggressive in their attempts to poach businesses and jobs away from other places. A typical way they do this is by offering tax incentives, commitments by the government to reduce the amount of taxes paid by the company. Kansas, for example, offered AMC Entertainment $36 million in tax incentives to move just a few miles from Kansas City, Missouri to Leawood, Kansas. In response, Missouri offered Applebee's almost $13 million to move its headquarters from Lenexa, Kansas to Kansas City, Missouri. Again, a move of just a few miles. This type of poaching is very common and happens at all levels of government: national, state, and city. The question, though, is whether this type of competition is beneficial. Does this type of competition across governments produce efficient tax rates that are best for society? Or does this competition result in worse tax rates for everyone? In this episode, we'll find out. There are two sides to the debate over whether government competition leads to the efficient level of taxes. The argument in favor is based on migration. People and businesses will move from one place to another until they find the combination of taxes and public services that's right for them. Those who prefer a high degree of public services will move to areas that have higher taxes and more public services. Those who don't will remain in places that have low taxes and low public spending. By the end of this migration, everyone is in a region that matches their preferences, and so all taxes are set at their efficient levels. While this logic seems sensible enough, there are many obvious problems with it. To name just one, migration is super costly, meaning that people and businesses can't easily move to a new location, even if that government's policies are more fitting. Because of this, there's not much supporting the idea that government competition leads to efficient tax rates. The argument against the idea that government competition leads to efficient tax rates comes in two strands. The first strand argues that in practice, most tax incentives are redundant, meaning that the government's money is given to companies that would have invested in that location anyway. Looking across a number of studies and surveys, it's estimated that roughly 2/3 of all incentive dollars are wasted in that they've gone to companies that would have pursued the project even without the government incentive. That money is therefore completely wasted, serving as mere icing on the cake for the company and its owners, but nothing more. Oh, and even just focusing on the minority of cases for which the tax incentive likely made the difference and encouraged the company to move, even in those cases, it's no sure thing that the tax incentive was beneficial. Yes, the company might have moved or expanded, but the cost of the government's giveaway could still have exceeded the benefit derived from that move or expansion. As just one example, my home state of Louisiana gave almost $1.7 billion to Cheniere Energy to expand its liquefied natural gas operation in Cameron Parish, an expansion that the company announced would create only 225 new jobs. That is, Louisiana, in effect, gave the company a $7 million tax break for each new job created. The knock-on effects of this expansion would have to be extraordinarily large for the benefits to be worth the high cost paid by the state, all for a project that might have happened even without the public funding. And it's not just that there are many examples of wasteful tax incentives being given away by governments. It's that the governments are so aware that many tax incentives are wasteful that many try to hide the size of the giveaways from the public. They do this by spreading the costs across a number of different governmental agencies, or by allowing third-party entities to construct the tax incentives, making public record requests impossible. So the reality is that government competition often leads to tax incentives that are redundant and wasteful. But it's also been argued from a more theoretical standpoint that government competition cannot lead to the efficient set of tax rates. The second argument makes this point. It contends that government competition, by its very nature, pushes everyone into the bad equilibrium of a prisoner's dilemma game, an equilibrium in which governments set inefficiently low tax rates. To see this, consider the simplest possible scenario, one in which there are two governments competing over a handful of companies. If both governments agree not to compete for the companies located in the other location, then let's say the welfare of both is 10. If either government tries to compete for the other's companies by offering tax incentives, that government will lure some companies across the border. raising its welfare a bit. The additional companies do help, but the cost of the tax incentives mean that the gains that come because of the new companies are relatively small. The other government, however, is substantially worse off since they've just lost companies. Employment, tax revenues, and income are all down. Finally, if both governments decide to compete, then the mix of companies across location remains about the same as before, except now the government's taken less tax revenue and so are less able to fund public goods like education and roads. This results in lower welfare for both. Now, as you can see, both places are better off if they both choose not to compete than if they both choose to compete for those companies. And yet, the devastating thing about a prisoner's dilemma game is that this good equilibrium with high welfare for both won't be the outcome. Instead, both governments have the incentive to compete for businesses. Take Government 1, for example. Suppose Government 2 chose not to compete. If Government 1 also chose not to compete, its welfare would be 10. But if it chose to compete, its welfare would rise to 12. The same incentive holds if Government 2 chooses to compete instead. It's still in Government 1's interest to compete because 4 is greater than 2. So no matter what Government 2 does, Government 1 will choose to compete. Because the same logic holds for both governments, both will choose to compete with the other, pushing the governments away from the good equilibrium to the bad equilibrium, the one with lower welfare for all. This model shows that even if they know that competition will lead to the bad equilibrium, governments acting in their own self-interests will still choose to aggressively compete with each other. Because if they don't, other governments will successfully poach their businesses. This model also shows that taxes aren't just set at an inefficient level. No, government competition forces the governments to set inefficiently low taxes, lower taxes than would be optimal. These low taxes then imply that tax revenues are too low, and as a result, there's not enough money spent on public goods. This could be one reason why public schools are chronically underfunded, roads are in constant need of repair, and why states persistently underfund their anti-poverty programs. So taking a step back, we've seen that the majority of the tax incentives given by governments are redundant and wasteful in practice. We've also seen that as a general property, competition pushes governments to set inefficiently low tax rates. Now, economists and policymakers have long known that this is a problem, that government competition leads to inefficiently low tax rates. And so many have been trying to find solutions. But how do you get governments to agree to not compete so aggressively and to jointly raise their tax rates? Well, the first approach tried was the obvious one. Governments can just get together and agree to behave in a more cooperative manner. This has been suggested many times for many different groups of governments. The Routing Committee suggested this for EU member countries. An official OECD report suggested it for the OECD members. And the National Conference of State Legislatures suggested it for U.S. states. The Routing Committee's report, for example, recommended that all EU member states levy at minimum a 30% statutory corporate tax rate on all companies. These attempts at global coordination, though, have been fruitless so far, and our prisoner's dilemma game shows why. While it's in the group's best interest for all governments to agree not to compete, it's in each country's individual incentive to break from this pact and to poach businesses away from other places. This makes cooperation all but impossible and pushes the group to the bad equilibrium. Outside of cooperative treaties, a number of papers have suggested various forms of punishment for governments who compete too aggressively. These punishments range from paying a fine to being ostracized from the global community. I have some published work in this field as well. A colleague and I have shown that a tradable permit system, like that used to combat pollution, could alter the incentives faced by U.S. states and motivate them to choose efficient tax rates. If you're interested in reading more about my paper or any other paper I've discussed in this episode, the links are in the description. Thanks for watching.